In Germany, everybody knows the Knigge, a book about social life written by an 18th century nobleman. However, very few people have ever actually read it. Today we will find out what a practical philosophy of social life by Baron Knigge is actually all about. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today I'd like to introduce a book to you that is well known but hardly ever read in Germany. A Practical Philosophy of Social Life, or The Art of Conversing with Men by Baron Knigge. Baron Knigge, his full name and title in German are Adolph Freiherr von Knigge. Baron Knigge was a German nobleman, lower nobility, impoverished nobility, who lived in the 18th century. In 1788, he published this book in German, Über den Umgang mit Menschen, literally translated, How to Deal with People. This is quite a famous book. There is also an English translation from 1805 under the title Practical Philosophy of Social Life, or The Art of Conversing with Men. It is available for free from Google Books. I will link to it in the video description. By the way, any quotes I use in this video are my own translation. I didn't look them up in this translation from 1805. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a printed copy. It seems to be out of print today, so I'll show you this German edition instead. First of all, one very important point. If Germans think of the Knigge, they usually associate the book with rules of etiquette and good behavior, such as how to properly set a table in great detail, or how to dress properly, again in great detail, who has to greet whom first, who has to hold the door open for whom, rules and things like that. Now the funny thing is, those things are hardly ever mentioned in the actual book. There isn't a single section, a single sentence about setting a table. Who has to greet whom is not mentioned at all. And the advice given in regard to clothing is very brief and general. Knigge says we should dress decently, neither too modern nor too old-fashioned, and that's it. So the actual book is totally different from the perceptions, from the ideas Germans have about it. How can this be? According to Wikipedia, the reason is that this book was already quite popular in Knigge's lifetime, and after Knigge's death it kept being published, and the publishers made changes, made additions to the book, and they kept adding rules of etiquette and good behavior, and those additions are what actually defines our modern perception of the book. So today we will find out what the actual book is about. The book is divided into 3 parts and I will discuss all of them. I will discuss the first part, since it is more general and therefore more interesting for us. I will discuss that one in more detail and I will discuss part 2 and 3 more briefly. Part 1 is again divided into 3 main chapters. The first is about dealing with people in general. It starts with the sentence, every human being is only as great in this world as what he makes himself to be. And Knigge says this sentence, this golden rule, is the great trick of boasters and braggarts who try to appear to be more than they actually are. but he says this rule is still also relevant for us because it teaches us to show ourselves from our best sides, to try to appear in a positive light, but without boasting or lying, just by being decent people. And the advice he gives in the remainder of the chapter frequently ties into that. For example, he says we should never do well at the expense of others, never try to appear in a good light at the expense of others. We should never take credit for something others have accomplished, because all of that would obviously again be bragging and lying. He also clarifies that showing ourselves in a good light doesn't mean that we should make ourselves slaves to others' perception. We shouldn't always, when we decide how to act in a situation, ask ourselves, oh, what will others think of me? How will this appear to others? But instead, we should act upon our own principles, and we should always stick to our principles. We should, for example, not float with the tide. One advice he gives in several sections in slightly different variations is, for example, if you have a friend who is held in high regards and has a high social status, and then he falls into disgrace and other people turn away from him, if we still regard him as just and wise and good, we should stick with him no matter what other people think. Now, there are many small sections, many small pieces of advice in the book and in this chapter, and I obviously can't discuss all of them in detail, so I will try to give you my general impression. First of all, Knigge emphasizes that we should treat other people in a good and decent way, that we should behave positively towards other people, that we should base our actions on a positive attitude. He says we should never lose confidence in ourselves, in God, good people, and fate. We should take interest in others. If we have a conversation with others, we should not waste their time with idle chatter or by asking useless questions, but we should try to provide something to them that is interesting or helpful or relevant to them. But we should also spice up our conversations with a bit of wit and good humor, so the perception Germans have of Knigge being rather stiff and strict, that is not necessarily true. It is more about attitude. For example, integrity is quite important. We should not gossip about others, we should not divulge their secrets, and we should make sure we always have a clear conscience. Advice that is also frequently given is to be modest and to use moderation in our wishes and needs in our way of life. I'd like to mention two passages I found to be especially nice. One is about criticism. Here Knigge says, "Be careful with criticism. There are few things in this world that do not have two sides." And a bit further he says, "Learn to bear contradiction, learn to bear criticism." And I think this is good advice still today, still valid today. Another section I liked deals with religion. Here Knigge says, "One should respect what is precious to others. Let everyone have the freedom we demand for ourselves." I believe Knigge primarily focuses on different Christian sects, variations of the Christian belief, such as the Jesuits that are mentioned a few times. But of course, this is still pretty good advice today in dealing with other cultures, other religions, and also for our general day-to-day life, that we should take things seriously that are important and that are precious to others. There are also a few sections that are curious or strange and maybe not that easy to figure out at first. One I found quite amusing was about, today we would say, professional advancement, where Knigge says, for that we frequently have to ask or even beg. Here I imagine the job applicant in a job interview falling to his knees, please hire me, which would be quite funny and probably not a good idea. The section is unfortunately short, so I can't really be sure what Knigge specifically means. I believe he refers to what we would call networking today, that we don't hesitate to ask our friends, our contacts for help. For example, to tell someone, hey, you work in a great company where I would also like to work. Are there open positions? Can you maybe introduce me to someone, recommend me to someone? Things like that we don't hesitate to ask favors from our contacts in order to advance in our profession. And maybe it also is about being proactive, because Knigge says we have to ask and beg because things won't come to us on their own. So maybe it's about, for example, not sitting in a corner and saying, oh, I do such great work, someday someone will recognize it and I will get promoted, but to actively approach our boss and say, hey boss, I want to be promoted to this position within the next 2 years. Is this realistic? What exactly do I have to do to make it happen? And there are also a few sections that have somewhat poor advice. One of those is about problems. Knigge says we should not discuss our problems with anybody. Other people should not know about them, not even our spouse, not even our wife or husband. We should only discuss our problems with people who can actually help us. Now, to some extent, this is certainly true. If I have marital problems, maybe I should not tell all of my colleagues. If I am in a financial crisis, I might not want to tell strangers about it. However, not talking about problems at all is dangerous, because talking about a problem by itself can already be a great help. And ignoring or suppressing problems is a quite dangerous path. And especially the advice in regard to relationships is problematic, because in a modern, open, equal, honest relationship, we clearly expect people to talk about their problems and be open about what worries them and not keep it a secret. So here this advice is clearly outdated. The second chapter in the first part is about dealing with ourselves. It is a rather short chapter. The first one in this edition is about 60 pages. The second is just about 5 pages, but it is still a rather good chapter, because Knigge says we should treat ourselves in the same decent, good, positive way that we treat others, in the same way that we have learned in the first chapter about treating others. He says the first and most important responsibility is to ourselves. We should trust ourselves, have confidence in ourselves. We should respect ourselves and act in a way that allows us to respect ourselves. And if necessary, we should also be strict to ourselves, such as a good friend who isn't afraid to tell us an unpleasant truth. Finally, the third chapter in the first part is about dealing with people of different characters. Here there is a very interesting first section that deals with the temperament theory from ancient Greece. I found this amusing because we discussed this one recently in the video about personality typologies. But it is very brief, and after that the chapter is about, let's say, dealing with different types of behavior, dealing with vain people, distrustful people, ungrateful people, pushy people, and many more like that. Now, again, I can't discuss all of that in detail. I can just give you my general impression. General advice Knigge frequently gives is to not get involved in bad behavior. For example, we should not flatter the vain, and we should not take advantage of squanderers. But we shouldn't try to educate people either. For example, there is a funny chapter about, nowadays we would say conspiracy theorists, esotericists, fanatics, and the like, where Knigge says, if those people aren't dangerous, just let them be. There is a funny quote here: "The earth is so big that a lot of fools have room on it next to each other." He also advises us to keep a distance from problematic behavior if it is possible, but also to rebuke, for example, people who divulge our secrets, to clearly voice criticism if necessary. And he asks us to support people who need our help. For example, people who are too modest, we should encourage to have more self-confidence. I would like to mention one section especially that I liked, that is about dealing with people who suffer from mental illnesses. Now, in the 18th century, those people clearly were not treated in a very decent way. They were considered lunatics and imprisoned in mental asylums. And here Knigge has a more positive view. He says, "At last I have noticed that confinement and any harsh mode of procedure almost always makes the evil worse." So the mental problems will get even worse if people are imprisoned and treated badly. And he greatly praises an institution in Frankfurt where he says the inmates are free to move about in the house and garden, and they are treated very decently, very well. And he says that a lot of them can leave this institution after a few years completely cured. The second and third part of the book is about dealing with specific kinds of people. In the second part, it's about dealing with people we have a relationship with in the domestic, private environment. And the third part is about social and public life. In part 2, for example, parents and children are discussed, married couples, master and servant, host and guest, and the like. Again, I will just give you a few examples. One section I really liked was about people of different ages. Now, I would kind of have expected Knigge, since he is an old man, to be on the side of the old. And at first it seems like it. He says the young should respect and appreciate the old, and the old in turn should instruct and teach the young and share their experience. But then there is a section where he is quite critical of old people, where he says old people would unnecessarily disturb the pleasures of the young. Old people wouldn't make the effort of recalling their own days of youth, and they would expect young people to act in the same way as they expect old people to act, which is of course unrealistic. So there is a lot of criticism of behaviors of old people. And also of behavior of young people. So he really seems to be fair here and criticize both parties a lot, give a lot of advice for both parties, which I appreciate. In the second and third part, since they are more specific, we encounter a lot more aspects, things that are clearly outdated. In the second part especially, there is quite an antiquated image of women. That is, of course, to a large extent due to the book being from the 18th century. It's always difficult to distinguish between Knigge's own attitude and the attitude of the time. For example, he does seem to have a somewhat positive attitude towards women. He says, for example, "The man who thinks and talks contemptuously of the whole female sex, I don't like to have as a friend." But he still clearly believes that women are lesser beings than men. For example, he believes that education is wasted on women because they should stick to the household and raising children and the like. He believes that infidelity is much worse if women do it than if men do it. So He clearly has outdated views, which are, of course, common for his time. But this section clearly are only of historical interest and don't have any practical use nowadays. There are also old-fashioned ideas of social rank, classes, and the like. For example, in a section about master and servant, he says most people would be born to be slaves, which is, of course, quite an outdated idea. I will talk about this problem a bit more in the third part. And there is some advice that is just factually outdated. For example, there are sections about traveling on horseback or in carriages, and you won't be able to use that knowledge in your daily lives nowadays. Part 3, as I said before, is about the public social life. Here there are sections about rulers and nobility, clergy, scholars, artists, merchants, and the like. And again, I will just give a few general impressions. One thing I noticed, especially in this third part, is that Knigge doesn't always hold with the general impression and the public impression and image of the different classes and standings. In sections where he discusses people who are of very high standing, regarded as superior, such as noblemen, clergy, scholars, doctors, and the like, he is very critical. He always emphasizes that there are a lot of noblemen who are idiots, a lot of clergymen who are just in it for the money, a lot of doctors who really have no idea of their profession, and so on. And in turn, in those chapters that discuss people of lower standing, such as servants, peasants, craftsmen, he emphasizes that there are a lot of good people there. He emphasizes, for example, how important and noble craftsmen are, and that they should really be treated better than they commonly are. So, he doesn't seem to hold too strictly to this distinction of classes and standings, but it also frequently becomes clear that he still believes that there are higher and lower people, that people are of different worth, that some people are worth more than others, and the like. He often also talks in a negative way about people of lower standing, and in this section where he emphasizes that we should treat them better, it is often in a rather patronizing way. Like basically saying, oh, we are so superior to them, and they are just stupid and lower and not as wise and whatever by nature. We can't blame them for it. We should instead instruct and lead them because they won't manage on their own, which is kind of positive, but in a very negative way. So this is not a good attitude we want to copy. One chapter I would like to mention that I liked, that was quite positive, was about dealing with animals. Here Knigge says, the noble, the just man does not torment any living creature. For example, he speaks quite critically of the types of hunts noblemen liked at the time, driving hunts with hounds and everything, where the prey was unnecessarily tortured for the fun and pleasure of the hunters. And he also speaks up against imprisoning animals in cages and teaching them tricks and the like. And this is clearly quite a progressive attitude. Now, one topic I have to mention, to discuss, that is quite problematic, is the topic of Jews, because there was lots of anti-Semitism in the 18th century and the time before and after, I'm afraid, and this also clearly shows in the book. Knigge clearly believes that Jews are a lesser type of people and lesser than Christians and whatever. So we have this anti-Semitic attitude all the time, even in the book. What I appreciate, however, is that Knigge addresses the problem of the professions, because as you might know, Jews were not given the same rights as Christian citizens. They were restricted in many ways, and there were especially a lot of restrictions in regard to the choice of profession. For example, Jews weren't allowed to own land. They were not allowed to join craftsmen's guilds. So there were a lot of professions they couldn't pursue. In the end, it was pretty much limited to becoming merchants or moneylenders. And then Jews were criticized heavily for being moneylenders, for being greedy and caring about money and whatnot. And Knigge points this out. He says it is a he basically says it is a shitty move to force them to become moneylenders and then complain about it. And I find it important that he at least mentions this piece of quite twisted morale, even if otherwise he still has this very negative attitude. Jews are still in pretty much in that group of people where he says they are considered lesser and inferior, but there are good people among them and so on. But as I said, there is still a lot of negative stuff about Jews. Finally, let's proceed to the critique. Now, the most important question here is this book still relevant, still useful today? Now, first of all, Knigge's general approach is to question one's own actions and to act according to clear principles. Knigge clearly says we should not deviate from our principles as long as we believe them to be just and valid. So, for example, we should not act based on our whim in every situation, but we should stick to the rules we make for ourselves. For example, I might say, I won't tell everybody everything, but I will never tell a lie. Or we might say, I will never talk badly about people who are not present. If I have to criticize someone, I will always tell them directly. And then we stick to these rules we make for ourselves. I believe this is something we do unconsciously to some degree, because we all have some general idea of what is good, what is right, what is decent. And we try to act according to those general ideas in our day-to-day lives. However, it can't hurt to put a bit more thought into it, to make the decision consciously, to really ask ourselves, what are the things, the rules, the principles I hold most dear that I really want to adhere to, and then try to adhere to them a bit more strictly in our daily lives. And I think the book can be a good inspiration for that. Throughout the book, I've experienced Knigge as an attentive observer of human behavior. He describes a lot of behaviors I still recognize from our daily lives today that are still valid today, and this is quite interesting. And frequently he approaches those behaviors in a neutral, unbiased way, and this is fair to both sides, such as in the section about people of different age I mentioned earlier. I also believe that Knigge has a quite positive attitude and a rather progressive attitude for the time. However, as we encountered before, the book is still riddled with outdated and ancient ideas. I think the main point here is, even though he says that some noblemen are idiots and peasants are important and whatnot, he still believes that people are worth more or less, that some people are inferior, others superior. He still holds this, I believe, as a kind of law of nature, and he hasn't yet reached this idea that people are of equal worth and have equal rights and should be treated equally. This is clearly still absent. So we have a lot of sections that are really outdated, only of historical interest and not useful anymore today. So if we actually read the book, we have to put some thought into it. We have to reflect upon the content. But I'd say this is true for every book. We should never just take everything for granted that we read. I have to warn you that the book is quite difficult to read because the language is pretty ancient. There are a lot of terms no longer used today, a lot of phrases no longer used today, and Knigge also tends to write in a rather complicated way with long, complex sentences. So the German edition I read was quite difficult to read, and I believe the English edition from 1805 isn't much better. So I have to warn you about that. If you actually end up reading the book, I would recommend to stick to the first part. This one has the most things, the most aspects, most advice that is still valid and relevant today. Although, according to etiquette, one should avoid excessive praise, I believe it is just decent to click the like button after enjoying a video, and if you appreciate a certain channel, maybe to subscribe to it. I would be quite happy about it. We will see each other again next week. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.